Good evening, friends. I'm Terrence Johnson, Associate Professor of Religion and Politics, and on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion, Afro-Pessimism and the Future of African American Religions. We're delighted to welcome my esteemed colleagues and friends, Professors Victor Anderson, Jennifer Leith, and Joseph Winters. You'll find a link to the extended bios of our panelists in the chat room. For now, I would like to just give a brief introduction of our speakers. Dr. Anderson is the Oberlin Theological School Professor of Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Professor Anderson has published 3 books, including Beyond Ontological Blackness, an essay in African American religious and cultural criticism, and Creative Exchange, a constructive theology of African American religious experience. Dr. Leith is the Queen's National Scholar and Assistant Professor of Black Religions at Queen's University outside Toronto. She's the author of the forthcoming From Black to Queer and Then to Where, Ethical Trajectories of Black Sexualities, which will be published in the Religious Cultures of African and African Diaspora book series at Duke University Press. Dr. Winters is the Alexander F. Heimeyer Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies at Duke University. He is the author of numerous journal articles and of the book Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, also published at Duke University Press. He's also working on a second manuscript, tentatively entitled Disturbing Profanity, Hip Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I will facilitate a conversation with my colleagues, and then we'll open the conversation up to the audience. If you have a question, please submit them in the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Tom Banchert, Michael Kessler, Ruth Goppin, Amy Vander Villette, and Shimon Tong at the Berkeley Center for their support and efforts to make this event happen. So as we were putting together this program, I thought of Tony K. Bambara's quote in The Salt Eaters. For sometimes a person held on to sickness with a fearsomeness that took 20 hard praying folk to loosen. So used to being unwhole and unwell, one forgot what it was to walk upright and see clearly, breathe easily, and think better than was taught, be better than one was programmed to believe, end quote. And as I thought about many of the challenges Afro-pessimism raises, right, to not only in terms of how we think about Blackness, but particularly the Black religion, I also was reminded of the work of Victor Anderson, his incredible book, Beyond Ontological Blackness, and the ways in which he sets up, in some ways, and anticipates Afro-pessimism, and really wants to try to figure out, highlight, right, all the critical issues we wanted to explore, but also like wanting to avoid a kind of cynical look at human creation and human possibility. So Dr. Anderson, I wonder if you could share with us in terms of, what kind of imprint did you want to leave, like in the fields of African American religious studies and Black theology and liberation in particular, with the publication of your book, Beyond Ontological Blackness?
Thank you, Terrence, and I'm really glad to be here with you and with friends. And I'm looking forward to the conversation as a conversation. Beyond Ontological Blackness was published in 1995. Up to that time, very few people in Black theology or African-American theological studies were paying any attention to deconstruction, postmodernism, philosophies of difference, and the like. In fact, most of us who were trained in university environmental religious studies were being exposed to different lines or ways of doing criticism, and particularly critical theory, which I was particularly interested in. But also we have a teacher like Cornel West, who is going to insist that we have to take seriously the postmodern turn. Many of us who came out of theological studies, as I did for Calvin Theological Seminary, we were confronted with, oh my God, we were confronted with Foucault. We were confronted with Derrida, these names, this French tradition that we were unfamiliar with. So we had, in many ways, expose our own theological ways of thinking to new methods of criticism. Beyond Ontological Blackness was an exercise in criticism. That's the first thing I want to say. It was to exercise a particular form of criticism, one that's deconstructive, postmodern, and one that takes difference to be paradigmatic. What I saw that was coming out of the theological schools at the time was what I call a pedagogy of repetition. But that means that if we grant to James Cone the notion of originality, not much was coming out of that circle that was original after Cone. Much of it was repetitive. Much of it did not include a furthering of difference. It was still mired in the concept of race paradigmatically. When Cornel West wrote Prophesied Deliverance, this was one of the great bombshells that introduced the whole phenomenon of class as a differentiating unit of criticism and cultural analysis with regard to theological discourse. What I wanted to do was to expand from class to also include sexual gender politics, to include a way in how difference now becomes paradigmatic rather than the triad of suffering, humiliation, and survival. It was those three triads that I found most paradigmatic in the work of Black theology. I began to ask questions like, surely not all Black people spend their entire lives suffering. Surely not all experience their lives and just trying to make a way out of no way. There was just too many examples in the Black bourgeoisie, too many examples in the Black middle class, too many examples in educated African-American people that was testing this paradigm of suffering, striving. And I was asking a different kind of question. I asked the question, when do we get to thrive? when do we get to beyond hope to something called flourishing? And to me, beyond ontological Blackness was a way of opening up that question, not to the negation of the other, but it's a way of opening up that question of thriving, flourishing, fulfillment, and what does it look like? It was in that context I introduced the word cultural fulfillment. And I wanted to use cultural fulfillment as a critical check to the liberationist paradigm of suffering and revolutionary consciousness that really was anything but revolutionary of consciousness, because it really required a certain kind of consciousness for its own agenda. I wanted to free up Black thinking, Black consciousness from this binary force that's held to the politics of whiteness for Blackness that whiteness created. I wanted to make difference, the paradigmatic note, as we think about African-American theological studies, as we think about the world of diaspora, as we take seriously the world of sexual gender politics, as we take seriously the social location of the multiplicity. And it's really a word for it. I was really after breaking the space for multiplicity over simplicity.
Great, thank you, Victor. And I'm curious, Dr. Leith, if, I know that when you were an undergrad at Harvard, I think even in your first year, you were, attending, Charles Street AME Church and, talking about a lot of these issues and really wrestling with, right, the legacy of James Cone, Dolores Williams, right, Emily Towns, and then bringing that to bear with Anderson's work. And I know this is something that has been on your heart for a long time and really trying to blend these worlds, right, the academic world and sort of the church world. But and I want to say that in part because often people think when you're reading someone like Victor Anderson, you're not necessarily engaged in religious community. So I wanted to set the stage for that. So with that backdrop, I'm wondering, what are the two, major conceptions, right, or ideas you walked away with from Anderson's work, and how has it allowed you to kind of problematize how we look at African-American religions?
Thank you for this question and for the opportunity to share with you today, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Anderson and Dr. Winter. It's good to be with each of you. I think the two things that strike me most in beyond ontological Blackness and the possibilities of the text for us as we think through the study of Black religion, are one, without being ontological, how are Blackness and racism real enough to combat the racism that resides as the very foundation and fabric of modern society? How do we contend with that which exceeds, bypasses, and altogether distinguishes itself from the ontological? Without being, it can feel like we're punching in the dark. Without being, how does nothingness fight? And that is, I think, a fundamental question that is sort of anticipated in Anderson's work, and also, of course, the grotesquerie and the abject. How do we capitalize on our deviance, especially if it cannot be detached? If deviance is a part of our everyday, if it is, in fact, perhaps even a normative aspect of our existence, of our being, and if we are not nothing, and we are not simply abject, what can be done then with the abject? Is there a proper instrumentalization if we are not, in fact, as people of African descent, the instrument, the necropolitical matter? And so with Anderson in mind, I think the work of Cathy Cohen in her essay Deviance and the Art of Resistance in particular, and the ways that she's developed that, is especially helpful, and gives us, I think, room to imagine how we live out a life of integrity, if you will, consistent with the complexities that Anderson opens the door for and lays out for us. I think, with those two pieces in mind, to the extent that African American religions had been studied in terms of liberation, like the Exodus, and survival and thriving of Hagar, and even the Blackness of Jesus and the opacity of God and people. One could have believed before Anderson's work that it was possible to escape the deleterious impacts of racism and social oppression by transforming the oppression of Black people, victimhood of Black people, and Blackness into inherent redemptive possibility for Black people and Blackness. As in, we could be saved because, and only because, or primarily because, we are oppressed. After Anderson, you can't believe that anymore. That's not possible. And the cultural fulfillment possibility, I think, requires what you described, Dr. Anderson, there at the end of the text, when you write, what is warranted is a healthy pessimism about the fragility of our efforts to transcend absolutely cultural activities that threaten cultural fulfillment, and a pragmatic hope that discerns and supports those activities that bring about more fulfillment of basic human needs and subjective goods. And I think that that really gives us a new place to work from, and a new place to live out a new reality, and that Anderson gives us the possibility to hold on to hope is quite a gift, and I'm not sure how many of us can retain that and can hold on to that, but I think that is what makes this work legible in the church, because without, and Anderson makes this point, without the hope, the pessimism alone doesn't preach. It won't preach. It can't preach. And so I think our challenge is to reconcile that. And so those are just a couple of the challenges that I think the gifts that Beyond Ontological Blackness provides for us, and help us into an Afro-pessimism.
Well, that was a powerful response, Dr. Lee. Thank you so much. And it really builds on nicely in terms of introducing Dr. Winters. And I'm curious, Dr. Winters, two slight questions. How did Anderson's work influence your own project on hope? But also, as you just talked briefly about that, how then does that set the stage for us to understand Afro-pessimism, right? Because in some ways, if in fact we are not fully human because of Blackness, and if there is this kind of notion of a social death, how then do you, as someone who's written extensively on Afro-pessimism, come to terms with hope in light of the social death and the afterlives of slavery that seem to be intertwined within Afro-pessimism? And by the way, we're going to link to one of your public articles on Afro-pessimism in the chat room.
Well, first, thank you, Professor Johnson, for organizing. I'm glad to be on this panel with these illustrious scholars, Professor Anderson, Professor Leith. Just excited to be here. Professor Anderson's Beyond Ontological Blackness is probably, I think, if I think about like some of the foundational texts, right? I think a certain text that without which I would not be here right now in the academy, that's one of them. So first of all, thank you for writing that. And I've had a chance to go back and reread it the last couple months. I think I think for one, as he pointed out, I think that there can be tendencies in the academy, even with all the talk about the transdisciplinary and so forth, that there can be a tendency to set up partitions, right? You know, so the fact that Anderson is thinking with, I mean, throughout he's thinking with Black theology, right? He's engaging, right? You know, Kant, right? You know, in the kind of aesthetic tradition. He's engaging Nietzsche. He's engaging Toni Morrison, bell hooks. So I think even just right when he talks about, you know, kind of postmodern Blackness, right, and trying to take seriously the ways in which Blackness is always already right entangled with right other modes of identification, relationships of power, including gender, sexuality. At the time reading that, right, that was just that just opened up all kinds of possibilities for me, right, and I think also. Yeah, I mean, his reading of Nietzsche, as Professor Leith pointed out, in this kind of grotesquerie, right? It was a way of reading Nietzsche that I hadn't really seen at that point, right? You know, beyond the kind of just like a will to nihilism or something like that. It was a kind of creative reading that helped me think about potentially and anticipated people who were thinking about Nietzsche in relationship to jazz, blues, and so forth. So that was, you know, I appreciate that. So I mean, I've been thinking a lot about, I'm just thinking about the comments of Professor Leith, and I've been thinking a lot about Professor Anderson's work in relationship to both Afro-pessimism, but also just other strands of Black thought right now, right? So even someone like Fred Moten and thinking about Blackness, right? And you know, as fugitivity or as, you know, para-ontology to think with, you know, Nahum Chandler. I think one of the things I've been interested in doing is right, not only reading, right, let's say, you know, Afro-pessimism through an author like Victor Anderson, but thinking about like, what happens if now we read Afro-pessimism differently, right? Now that we have a juxtaposition that usually people don't put together, right? Like, I mean, like often people who are reading Afro-pessimism are not necessarily reading, right, religious ethicists and theologians, right? So I'm thinking about, so after we actually juxtapose the two, and we think about this passage of this kind of tension between pragmatic hope and a kind of healthy pessimism, right? I actually think that we can actually read someone like, let's say, Frank Wilderson differently, right? So there are moments where, I mean, Wilderson says, right, look, I'm pessimistic when it comes to the way the world is organized, right? But I'm actually optimistic about Black people's capacity to set it off, whatever that means, right? And, you know, if you think about someone like Calvin Warren and his essay on nihilism, on Black nihilism, the politics of hope, he says, look, Black nihilism is not against hope, right? He says it's against a particular usage of hope, right? He says it's against a particular, what he calls a kind of a compulsory understanding of hope, right? Where hope has to somehow find its end in the political big P. You know, we can think about what that means, right? But spiritual hope, he says, is actually one of the conditions of possibility for Black nihilism, right? So I take it that he's trying to take seriously a kind of hope that doesn't necessarily, right, that isn't compelled to find its end, right, in like American democracy, which he sees as requiring the sacrifice and a certain kind of redemptive sacrifice of Black people. So this is all just me saying that I actually think there can actually be really productive conversations, right, such that I'm not calling Afro-pessimism hopeful necessarily, but I do find moments where the language of spiritual hope, and someone like Jared Sexton, he talks about the possibility of the poetic or poesis. He goes to poesis, right, which is, you know, that it can become a very vague, right, concept. But I take it that he's trying to take seriously the possibility of inventing and creating something out of nothing or something like that. But there still is the problem, I guess. I mean, there still is the concern about ontologizing the condition of Black people, right, and conflating that with, if not suffering, certainly a kind of antagonistic relationship to the human, right. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't see I don't see an incompatibility necessarily, right, between this kind of interplay between a kind of pragmatic hope, right, which I think plays itself out maybe in Wilderson's politics. I mean, his activism throughout his life, right, and a kind of healthy pessimism, right, towards certain kinds of not just liberalism, but towards certain kinds of ostensibly liberative horizons like Marxism, right, like radical feminism and psychoanalysis, who Wilderson draws from, but says, look, there's still certain assumptive logics that are anti-Black. But anyway, I'm talking way too much, but thank you.
This is really helpful. And as you were talking, I'm wondering, you seem to be very generous in terms of the ways in which the Afro-pessimist might actually read religion. I'm wondering, how do we still deal with social death? We're going to bracket that for later, but there's a great analysis. So I'm curious, Dr. Leaf, in some ways, I don't want to overread your new project, but in some ways, I'm wondering how, if at all, can Afro-pessimists benefit from first, second, and even third wave women as scholars? And how is your work attempting to bring new light to what womanists have been doing for the last few decades?
Thank you for the question. I think that, when we just return to Alice Walker's seminal definition, there are just a couple lines that I think are helpful here. Usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, or willful behavior, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. I think this aspect of the definition is critical. I think this is at the heart of where womanism and Afro-pessimism intersect. It begs the question, are we willing to know to the point of recognizing anti-Blackness as a circumstance that will always be with us? Are we willing to know to the extent that we recognize that the very logics that we use are forged in anti-Blackness? Are we willing to know to the extent that we recognize how knowledge itself has been constructed against our being? And I think that when we become that courageous, that we're willing to know, even to the point of recognizing our non-existence or our abject existence in the minds of others, I think that we have done the womanist way. We have lived out, and we are living in and through a womanist way. We are theorizing in a womanist way, and so I think that there are methods that are important. I think that womanism contributes, but this commitment to disrupting anti-Blackness, this commitment to what Warren calls the post-metaphysical, this commitment to discerning being, notwithstanding the limitations of metaphysics and Black humanism. That work is, I think, tantamount to what Emily Towns describes in Voices of the Spirit as theorizing and practicing work as one as a task, if you will, of avowal rather than denotation. So I vow as a womanist to do a particular kind of work to combat anti-Blackness, to uphold the possibilities and with beyond ontological Blackness in mind, again, the diversities of Blackness and Black womanhood, or what it is to be Black and gender identified, or sexually oriented, if you will. And so I think what is possible because of first and second and third and millennial wave and womanist traditions is a retrieving of archive. And I think that has been consistent in womanism from its inception and throughout. It's always making meaning of something that others have said is meaningless or is not valuable. It's identifying archive where others have seen junk and trash, and recognizing, instead of the value of the heroic, the value of the diurnal and the everyday, and utilizing that source. And so the work that is happening in Tracy Hux's Yoruba traditions and African American religious nationalism, and the work that is happening also even as early as Dolores Williams, when she is reading Black church conditions and practices and activities. It is a culling, it is a harvesting of archive that has otherwise been forgotten. And I think what is a hopeful repetition, it is doing the work that, for instance, Saidiya Hartman has done in Scenes of Subjection, where we not only go back to the archive, but then we repeat the archive in order to name and claim that space as a part of helping one another toward cultural fulfillment.
No, I like the way you bring in the archival piece as a way not only remembering, but like cultivating what has been rejected and disdained. And I'm curious, Dr. Anderson, you call it at the end of your project this idea of a new public theology. And I'm wondering, how do you think about public imagination, public theology, in light of Calvin Warren's recent charge that we actually need to systematize Black spirit? And I think Black spirit is one of those categories that I think Dr. Leith will say, yeah, we've actually in some ways buried that category because it conjures up all the images, right, that speak to our negation. And so I'm curious, in terms of, without necessarily going into Professor Warren's specific idea of Black spirit, how do you think about this idea of a Black spirit? I know we've talked about it a lot, and is it also a kind of ontological Blackness that you're trying to push against? And then how does that tie into your call for a kind of new creative public theology?
Yes, by the way, I have been so, I'm gonna use the old Christian language, I've been so blessed today. You have all blessed me. And so I just want to say that it's an amazing thing for a older scholar to see and feel what gratification looks like. And I want to thank all of you for doing that. I agree. I have real problems with the evocation of spirit. It brings up an old specter. That old specter is one that dominated Hegel's phenomenology. And how you think of spirit there also evokes how the same feeling I have in Du Bois when he talks about the race has not yet given to the world its great gift, which is its spirit, right? So it's the spiritual gift that Black folks are supposed to give to world universal history. So he plops it so emphatically, without any nuance, without any connection, and it appears to me ad hoc. I just had to say it that way. I've been thinking about why it appears to me as ad hoc, and that's because what he says, everything before it. One would think everything before it should not lead to that. So then when I looked at the acknowledgement, I was really surprised when he said, I thank my God. Well, I don't know to what extent nothing can engage in such practices. Okay, to thank God is to actually enter into a world of located world in space already well articulated by our ancestors, what they believe is their hopes and who they believed in. And so the idea of spirit to me in that book appears rather ad hoc, unconnected, and I like to say in a more generous tone, it appeared to me an escape from the burden of the nihilism that is imposed. That is, if you take the bulk of the book seriously, one has to say, oh, come on, man. Now we have to strive after something called spirit, whatever that is. So I'm not going to focus on that, but I'm going to be generous enough to try to say that, I mean, just say, of course, all of us are in search in many ways of transcendence. If the language of spirit is an invocation of transcendence from the torture, ontological torture, from the history of abuse over our bodies, from the ambiguity in which flesh and body are torn asunder, from soul, if the language of spirit can evoke in us a sense of transcendence, then I can accept that. But it seems to me that has always been, and that's what I mean by the grotesque ambiguity of the Black religious life. We have always had a profound sense of creating out of crucible of hell an economy of hope. What I call in another piece, the economy of existential, Black existential hope. It's in the slave songs. It's in the stories that are told. It's in what Charles Long would call the material ground of Black religious life, shows itself in this duplicity of recognition of hell, and at the same time, this reach in hope, in vision, and which I just simply call transcendence. I think your work in A Tragic Soul Life is really about that economy of Black existential hope, where anybody who should actually embrace Warren's notion of nothing, it should be Black people. Indeed, I buy that part of it. That makes perfectly good sense to me. But I wink my eye another way, and I'm amazed, and I remain amazed at the creativity and transcendence that Black folks through all their suffering have imprinted on the Black world of religion, culture, aesthetic, our sense of being. And it's in that sense that I find not the contradiction to what Warren is saying, but I find its incompleteness. And that's where we have to, in some sense, pragmatic hope is just that. It speaks against what we take to be absurd. So when I'm reading Wilderson, when I'm reading Warren, they do something that I really do appreciate. They engage in a critique that is predicated on shock. Yes, they shock us. We're not supposed to think this way. We're programmed not to think this way. It has a profound effect of intellectual and existential shock. And over against it, we're forced to ask about, what about the ethical? What about transcendence? What about these matters of Black life? And I think that's really where I really want to locate myself. I want to locate myself in the recognition of Black suffering and the absurdity of the afterlife of slavery. I want to admit there's something right in the narrative structure of what's being told and the grammar that is being produced. But Terrence, I'm an ethicist. My current concern is with the ethical. And I still have to ask that question, when and where does it break through? In your book on Tragic Soul Life of Du Bois, I think you've done a marvelous job at tracking how that in this one moral philosopher, how he could recognize the absurdities of Black life, and at the same time, through poetics, through description, through depiction, he could also find ways in which Black souls are constantly articulating themselves over against the absurd. I think that's what my work was really trying to foreground when we put it on an ethical level or when we put it on a religious level of transcendence.
No, thank you, Dr. Anderson. You're always very generous, and even in your critique, just really able to give life to people and life to those of us who struggle to produce something. But I think we're still left with this idea of social death, right? And trying to make sense of the human. And as you were talking, I think about Du Bois that we often miss, as he talks about introduction, the forethought of souls, this idea that I wanted to look at the human passion and sorrow of the people, which is like really interesting. And I'm wondering, Dr. Winters, can you say more about, does Afro-pessimism allow us the very possibility of creating, disrupting, right, idea of human passion and sorrow? And so I think in part, in order to answer that question, how does Wilderson in particular define, say, the human and Blackness? And how do they overlap, and how are there tensions in those two categories? And then what is the possibility then of the human who is inscribed, or who is in this nothingness, inscribed with the Black body?
No, that's great. Thank you for that question, Professor Johnson. So I take it that, and this is, I mean, I'm still trying to understand some of the moves that he's making, because I take it in the film book, right, in Red, White, and Black, there seems to be a kind of structuralist account of these things, right? So the Black is a kind of position, right, or positionality, right? And I take it that the human, I think there's a kind of indebtedness to Sylvia Wynter in some ways, right? But I take it that the human, right, sometimes that's coextensive with civil society, right? But the human for him is a space defined by certain kinds of qualities, right? So capacity, for instance, is something that he says, right? Capacity, the possibility of recognition, right? The possibility of inclusion, even if there might be certain kind of contingent forms of violence against certain groups, right? That's not for him, right? So we might say that the human, right, is what he would call white subjects and what he says junior partners in ways that's right. I mean, that's his language, right? Right. Those that without a doubt face, like, he starts with something like sentience, right? He says that we're all sentient beings, so we all suffer. I think the concern for him is to go to the point about ethics and ethical grammar, is that the human doesn't have an ethical grammar, right, to actually, right, make sense of and resolve Black suffering, because it's predicated on Black suffering, right? And so then the question becomes, well, there's a lot of the questions we could ask about that, but I take it that there's something about the human that involves the possibility of recognition, a grammar for suffering, and something like capacity, right? And the way that he talks about the Black, and this is his language, the Black as or slave, right? Right. But that he sometimes uses that interchangeably, right? That the Black's relationship to the human is necessarily an antagonistic one, right? Like, it's necessarily antagonistic, and it's necessarily one that there's a kind of essential violence that's always being directed towards the Black, right? Not contingent, right? Precisely because he would say the psychic coherence, right? There's a lot of psychoanalysis here, right? But the psychic coherence of the human depends on, right, a kind of violence, but not always, sometimes symbolic, sometimes linguistic, but a kind of violence directed towards Black people. And I take it that in the film book, what he's trying to do is suggest that films actually give us some insight into this, right? Like a lot of film theorists do, right? Like he would say that, like, even as most films about, let's say interracial intimacy or most films that deal with race in some way have some kind of Hollywood format that leads to some kind of resolution. But he'll say, right, that there's these moments where the kind of narrative arc gets disrupted, right, by other kinds of, like, by, sound, right, or the movement of the camera or lighting or something like that. So I'm not suggesting that's a hopeful moment, but it seems to me that there's a moment where, right, we can say there's a kind of unraveling, right? There's a moment where the film's narrative arc, the attempt to reach something like a conclusion or resolution, actually breaks down, right? In the face of Blackness, in the face of the contradictions that films replicate, right? I don't know if I'm making sense, right? So that's one. I would take it in regard. So just one more. I think that, particularly, let's say in his new book, Afro-Pessimism, I actually think that if we take seriously, like, how he begins, right, and how he ends the book, he begins with, like, on a gurney, right? He begins saying, this was my a psychological breakdown, right? Now, this is before Lamar Bruce's book comes out, right, and others, I think, Therese Pickens and so forth, right, the kind of thinking about Blackness and madness. But he starts there, right, and he starts by just thinking, just like I'm just saying there's a kind of just exposure, like saying like, look, there's a kind of, there's just like, right, there's something about being Black in this world, right? He couldn't explain it, but he was just like, I just broke down, right? He ends the book talking about the death of his mother, right? And he ends the book talking with almost a poem / prayer, right? He / the book almost with a poem / this is this new book, Afro-Pessimist. He ends with talking about, he says, maybe I'll see you on the other side, but he mentions both Jesus and the Orishas in a certain way, right? There's also moments in interviews where he says, I consult with the ancestors from time to time, right? He says, I have a Babala, and this is this is it. This is there. It's not front and center in his work, but I take it that those of us who are interested in religion, right? That's where we, in a world that's often, militantly secular, we have to look for those things on the margins, right? So I take it that for him, social death, and I'll just finish with this. I think that for Wilderson, I think for Sexton as well, there's an acknowledgement of Black life, but Black life always under, it seems to me, for them, I take it, Black life that is always under the shadow, right, of this kind of ontological violence, right? Doesn't mean that, right? I mean, and I also take it that there's a moment in Afro-pessimism where he says, look, social death is not, right? Social death is historical. It's something that emerged historically and became deeply entrenched in the world, such that, right, the image of the Black, right, has, does certain kind of things, pattern things across across space and time. But he would say that, and this is interesting, he says, it's not theology, he says, right? So he has a very Marxist understanding of theology is a placeholder for that which, a commitment is something that can't change, which is interesting because I take it for Professor Anderson's work, there's some about public theology that's actually an opening to possibility and opening to transcendence. But I do take it that he does say that, listen, social death, this can be eliminated, but it won't involve for him like something like the fulfillment of something. It'll involve something like some kind of destruction. And it will involve us recognizing, even black people, he would say, how much we've invested in, right, a kind of anti-Blackness, right? So anyway, that's just some thoughts.
No, that's a great point. And I'm wondering if we have time very quickly, Dr. Leaf, if you can say how your new project on queer philosophy, queer theology, what is that opening up for you, and how are you trying to problematize, right, so social death, but also this ongoing master-slave, right, binary that appears to be in Wilderson's work?
So, I mean, I think at the heart of the problem of anti-Blackness, as Wilderson puts it, is relationship. It is a relational problem. It is this master-slave dialectic that we cannot break free from, and so it strikes me as interesting that both womanism and the way E. Patrick Johnson puts the definition of queer are very much relational. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, and then Johnson puts it queer is to queer as reading is to throwing shade. And then I would just add to that, because of what the two have done, queer is to queer as womanist is to feminist. We might add, and so I think what's happening when we kind of appeal to these analogous relationships is that we implicitly, explicitly name the fact that there are relationships in place. And I mean, this is what I think Wilderson is also getting at with the concept of meta-aporia. I mean, this is what is at stake. It's not just what's happening in the content that is playing out in the categories, but the categories themselves and the methodologies that are being deployed in the metaphysical approach. And so I think I think that what queer gives us the opportunity to do, and when we think about what E. Patrick Johnson is talking about in a latter part of this definition, when he names one for whom sexual and gender identities always already intersect with racial subjectivity. I think he is inviting us to rethink relationship but always remembering the ways that anti-Blackness is coded into the very fabric and foundation of our epistemologies. And so I don't know that queer theology is the direction. I prefer in this moment queer possibility as what can disrupt Blackness and the relationships that strengthen it. So with queer possibilities, justice is not the same. It's not a condition. It's something that does things. Whatever destabilizes anti-Blackness and the relationships that depend upon it are justice. Are if you will, and if we can retain that term. And so I think queer possibility is at the heart of a healthy Afro-pessimism.
No, thank you. And so this kind of leads, we have a question in the audience, and a couple questions. One from Marlon Milner, PhD student, or PhD candidate at Northwestern University. He writes, given what Dr. Winters has said earlier, why do you think there's a reluctance in Afro-pessimism, right, to engage Black religious theorists like Dr. Anderson? There's sufficient engagement with this literature. There's insufficient engagement with this literature and with this book, which is a precondition for this present line of thought. And you kind of hinted at this earlier, Joseph, in terms of sort of I would say the lived expression of his religiosity is actually potentially in tension with, right, some of the claims. So can you say more about why do you think in general Black religion, right, or Black religious thought appears to be on the margins within this tradition?
I'll just say real quick. I mean, that's a great question. So this is something that I've actually, and I'd love to hear other people, think about. It's just something I've been thinking a lot about, right? Like that it seems to me that not just Afro-pessimism, but others, you may just say other strands. There seems to have been a break at some point, right? Where like Black religion, right, and like Black studies, right? Even though, I mean, clearly, most people I know who are doing Black religion, Black theology are reading people in Black studies, right? It doesn't always go the other way, right? And I think that I do think that conversations are happening precisely because of the, the kind of, well, I can just say in my experience, I do think those conversations are happening. I think precisely because I think my sense is that within contemporary Black studies there is this kind of gesturing, right, towards economies of the sacred, towards grammars of the sacred, right? I mean, whether it's, as Professor Anderson pointed out, I mean, whether we're talking about the language of spirit, I mean, whether we're convinced by the move to spirit, right? But I mean, Professor Warren going to the language of spirit, also reading Moten not as an optimist, but as a mystic, right? And so you think of Moten's work on Blackness and mysticism. I'm also thinking just about the way in which someone like Zakiya Jackson is thinking about the mythical, right? And J. Cameron Carter has connected her work to Charles Long. So I think there's a lot of possibilities, but my sense is, and this is just off the top, there just seems to be this kind of very conventional secularism in the academy. That's all I can say, right? Such that certain people might wrestle with some of these claims, right? Maybe in private, but bringing that to the conversation, right? Expanding on what do you mean by spirit? What do you mean by the mystic? What do you mean by the sacred? What do you mean when you use the language of prophetic community like Moten, right? It just doesn't seem like there's that much interest in necessarily fleshing that out, right? I don't know if I'm making sense, but so I'm actually seeing a lot of gesturing towards religious language, we might say certain grammars of the sacred. And what I've been interested in doing the last few years is trying to say, well, how do we unpack this? And how do we actually see anticipations, right, in Black religious studies scholars, right? Like Professor Anderson, right? Like, Dolores Williams, for instance, right? I'm thinking about, Sisters in the Wilderness, right? And the kind of, right, the emphasis on surrogacy, right? And surrogate suffering, right? And the way in which that's getting taken up by somebody like, Alice Eve Weinbaum and her work on reproductive. So anyway, I'm just suggesting that there seems to be a wedge at times between Black studies and Black religious thought. I mean, even if you think about the kinds of, I'll be quiet. There's other people want to talk, but I just think there seems to be a wedge, and sometimes that gets played out in Afro-pessimism.
And I'm wondering, Professor Anderson, is your concern with the use of, or the lack of use of religious sort of language and rhetoric and symbols within Afro-pessimism, or was it actually that people use religious rhetoric and assume there is no ethical component or any ethical commitment tied to that religious language? And so it sounds like you're more concerned about a different kind of use of religious language that includes this ethical commitment and ethical possibilities. And can you say more about why that's more important than simply including a religious sign or symbol?
Yeah, the one thing I am very taken by in Wilderson, for instance, and in Warren, is when they do turn to their biographies, they themselves are engrafted into the religious effects of culture. That's the one thing I have to say. When I was being a little bit snooty about, I want to thank my God. Well, I know where that comes from. I hear the resonances with that. It's embedded in the religious effects of culture. And it's not as if we theologians or theological religious scholars have a monopoly on how the language religious effects of culture gets articulated. But it comes through. This is where I really mean by the grotesque here. If you read these texts with only one eye, you might miss something really important that the other eye reveals. And so we have to read through the ambiguity rather than sealing off on one way of reading to look for the more that also shows itself in the text. That's really what I mean by transcendence of the everyday. It comes in through writing. It comes through sometimes unreflectively. It comes through in Wilderson as he talks about his mother, as he talks about what it was to grow up as a Catholic. But that was a form of difference in his own experience. He understands this power of difference because it's embedded in the religious effects of enculturation. And so it really is, the language is what Joseph called the grammar of sacred. It's not the domain of religion. We don't have ownership on it. We don't have ownership on how it gets articulated. But that's the beauty of what we do. When I talk about Afro-American religion, that's the beauty of what we do. What we do is we seek it out. We look for it. We try to look into unexpected places in which the religious effects of culture shows itself. Wittgenstein said, what cannot be said must be shown. And so we're looking for it in all these moves. One of the things Joseph said, let me say this really quickly. Joseph, you're right. In the history of Black studies, religion had never really been taken seriously. It was cut off to the domain of the theological circles. It was always held with a sense of suspicious. So when one goes through the genealogy of Black studies, it was primarily focused on the social sciences, literature, history, and the like, but religion was always held in those contexts with a certain amount of skepticism and was confined primarily to what Bill Hart calls the standard narrative of the Black church. And so I think we have to understand that as a bearing on why this disconnect between Afro-pessimism and Afro-neoliberalism is to ask, where is it coming out from? It's coming out from English departments. It's coming out from philosophical thinking. It's not coming out of the traditional silos of theological studies. I just wanted to drop that in.
No, I mean, there's a lot that you just said. I just want to add very quickly. I'm wondering, either, particularly Dr. Leaf, this idea that is that part of the gift, right? The gifts of Black folk, not that religion is somehow sui generis, or not that religion is somehow ingrained within Black folk, but in part, the very social conditions force them to utilize the available resources. And this happened to be one that they use in a very creative way. And so in some ways, I think the idea of trying to claim spirit is some way of trying to claim, right, what had been denied. And not, again, not for purposes, I think, that are otherworldly, but for real mechanisms, like in terms of hoodoo, in terms of really trying to, I think B. Smith calls it as a cultural idiom. And so I'm just sort of curious in terms of how do we, so how do we make sense of this, right? In terms of the use of religion as not simply natural, but kind of creative use that based on a social reality in terms of what the people have to use for their sense of freedom.
I absolutely think that that you know these invocations of the religious are I think a kind of expression, if you will, of cultural pragmatism. And I think, you know, I just want to put a finer point on this. I think that the resistance to the field of religion and to theology, more precisely, is absolutely intentional. It is a rejection of the colonial. It is a decolonial move to say we'll read religion in the ways that we practice it, in the ways that it's true to our lived praxis, but not the way that the way that religionists read it, not the way that scholars of religion read it, not the way that apologists especially read it, because there is there is this kind of undertone, especially in Wilderson's work, when he asked the bishop, you know, did the Africans ask you to come? and he gets in trouble for this, but it's very clear, you know, he's willing to participate in the catechism classes. He shows up. He knows his Catholic doctrine and discipline, but when the bishop wants to raise a collection for a trip to Africa, you know, excuse me, but hell no, because it's very clear that that there's no invitation for that, and to contribute to that would be to contribute to the colonizing, the anti-Black, the oppressive venture. And I think that we who are in the Academy of Religion really need to reconsider and rethink our placement and how we situate ourselves. Not whether or not others are reading us. I think we continue to read others, but I think we need to do some internal reading of ourselves and to be as disruptive as possible. And I think that in the spirit, no pun, of Charles Long, I think we really need to do this this work of acknowledging our hybridity and really helping one another to tease out the ways that we live in the inflections of religion. And so translating, I think, across the disciplines, for those in disciplines that are not religion but who are speaking in religious language, how it matters that these terms have been through the refining fire of the discipline of religion, what that means and what exactly is being signified when one names their experience, and claims that all of us can, because of our personal experience, be expert in or on or about religion.
That's a great point. I want to bring in our colleague, Professor Burnett at Fordham. It's a great question. Two great questions. The last one is there a problematic heroic genius emerging in Black studies and Afro-pessimism?
You may have got your answer by the silence.
Yeah. And he also raises the questions, are there ways in which the lack of nuance, and I think Dr. Leaf pointed to this, in the usage of religious sacred grammars due to the failures, right, in certain Black religious communities, Christian ones in particular, to tend to do what Anderson calls the crisis of legitimation?
I'll just say something about the first question. I mean, the question about aesthetic of heroic genius. I actually do think that's happening, even though I do see people like Wilderson actually trying to refuse it. right? In certain ways. I mean, I mean, you can think about what it means to, to write a kind of book for a broader audience, right? Like as he did with Afro-pessimism. But there is this kind of conflation of Afro-pessimism with him. And I often, whenever I hear him speak, he's always gesturing towards other people, particularly kind of second generation of scholars like Patrice Douglas, for instance, or Cecilia Cooper. Those who are trying to think of the intersection of Afro-pessimism, Black feminism, right, queer studies, trans studies, and so forth. But I mean, we can think here with the aesthetics of the genius. We can also think of Adolph Reed's notion of the broker, which I mean, so I'm really interested in how that seems to be a kind of pattern and a kind of structural kind of positioning, right? That people get positioned as the mouthpieces, as the voices, and as the kind of exceptional kind of expressions of something. And even as they're pushing back against it, it doesn't seem to be able to, it's just kind of relentless.
And
No.
it does seem to me that in Wilderson, but especially in Warren, there is a near explicit rejection of the category of heroic genius, which always plays itself into the political. That the political becomes a platform which the heroic genius shows itself in a cultural form. I think when you read the reading of these texts, it does seem to me that there was a displacement of that metaphor and for another kind of entity emerging. I'm trying to respect the word nothing, okay? But something that emerges either as critic, or just used as critic, that has a certain irony, especially in Wilderson, who still has not lost his revolutionary consciousness. Okay, so once again, here you have a transference from what is true and recognizable, and yet a tendency in Wilderson to continue to remember his own embeddedness into his own life story. He cannot free himself from the imprint of the revolutionary in his own consciousness.
Well, this has been an extraordinary conversation, and unfortunately, we are out of time. But I just want to thank, I think I can speak a little bit for Dr. Winters and Dr. Leith, that we want to thank you, Dr. Anderson, for joining us. This was like a huge honor. And I asked you thinking, well, he's probably gonna be really swamped, he can't do it, but so we are honored that you were with us to share your work. And I believe we need more conversations, right, like this to really engage sort of the lasting impact of your project. And I really want to thank Joseph and Jennifer. You guys are extraordinary scholars. Really appreciate the work you're doing and just your collegiality, right, and the spirit you bring to your work and to your engagement with Black religion. So I want to thank the audience, thank the Berkeley Center, and this concludes our talk.